May 8, 1945, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The bottle sweated in his hands. Not from heat, the Kansas spring was mild, almost pleasant. The condensation came from somewhere else, somewhere impossible. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann stared at the green glass, at the cursive script that seemed to mock him in a language he barely understood. Ice. In the middle of nowhere. In the middle of a war. In unlimited supply. His fingers still remembering the frost of the Ostfront, the rationed ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt acorns, the half-frozen potato soup. Those same fingers now held something colder than Russian winter, something that shouldn't exist. Not here, not now, not for him. The American guard who'd handed it to him, a boy, really, maybe 19, was already walking away, whistling, as if giving away ice-cold luxury to enemy prisoners was the most normal thing in the world. Behind Hartmann, 47 men of his former battalion stood in the same stunned silence. Each held an identical bottle. Each wore the same expression of cognitive dissonance, as if their brains were physically rejecting what their hands touched. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The Führer had promised them the Americans were weak, decadent, on the verge of economic collapse, that the Reich's industrial might was supreme, unmatched, eternal. But the bottle in Hartmann's hands told a different story, a terrifying story. A story not about military defeat that was already obvious, already accepted, but about something far more devastating, the realization that they had never stood a chance. Not because of tactics or terrain or timing, but because they had been fighting an enemy that could afford to lose. An enemy so wealthy, so industrially overwhelming, that it treated war like a part-time job while continuing to manufacture fizzy sugar water for fun. The propaganda had lied. But worse than that, the propaganda had been laughably, absurdly wrong. And this bottle, this simple, mass-produced, throwaway consumer good, was the proof. Hartmann raised it to his lips. The carbonation exploded on his tongue, sharp, sweet, alien. 32 years old, Wehrmacht officer, veteran of Poland, France, and Russia, believer in the 1,000-year Reich. And in that moment, with that sip, everything he thought he knew about the world dissolved faster than the fizz on his tongue. This is the story of how Coca-Cola destroyed the Third Reich more thoroughly than any bomb ever could. August 1939, Essen, Germany. Klaus Hartmann remembered the speech. Everyone remembered the speech. He'd stood in the Krupp factory courtyard with 12,000 other workers, engineers, and their families. The loudspeakers crackled with static before the Führer's voice cut through the humid summer air. The German worker, Hitler proclaimed, supported by German engineering, has created an industrial miracle that will reshape the world. While other nations grow soft with luxury, we have forged our strength through discipline and sacrifice. The crowd roared. Hartmann, then a young engineer, fresh from the Technical University of Berlin, roared with them. Why wouldn't he? The evidence surrounded him. The massive Krupp works stretched for kilometers, blast furnaces, rolling mills, the steady percussion of progress. Germany produced more steel than Britain and France combined. The Autobahns were the envy of the world. The Volkswagen promised motorization for the masses. The economic miracle of the 1930s had lifted Germany from the ashes of Versailles, humiliation, into what seemed like unstoppable ascendance. Even the sacrifices made sense within this narrative. Coffee became scarce. Ersatz from roasted barley would suffice. The German spirit didn't need decadent foreign beans. Butter rationed? Margarine was more efficient anyway, more modern. Each substitution, each tightening of the belt was reframed not as deprivation, but as strength, as proof that Germany could stand alone against a hostile world. The Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy program sent Hartmann on a cruise to Norway in the summer of '38. 600 workers aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff, all experiencing luxuries previously reserved for the wealthy. See? The Reich provides. The Reich cares for its people. The Reich is building a new world. When war came in September 1939, the transition felt natural. The economy had already been on a war footing for years. The rationing intensified, yes, but the message remained consistent. Sacrifice today for glory tomorrow. Total mobilization, total commitment. Germany against the world. Hartmann volunteered for officer training. By June 1940, he was in France watching German tanks roll past the Arc de Triomphe. The French had collapsed in 6 weeks. The British had fled at Dunkirk. The Führer's industrial genius had been proven on the battlefield. German steel, German organization, German will, unstoppable. "We've broken the French," his commanding officer, Hauptmann Werner Strasser, said as they occupied a cafe in Paris. "We'll break the British by Christmas. And after that?" He lit a cigarette, real tobacco, looted from French supplies. "After that, we'll have all the time in the world to build the new Europe. Imagine it, Hartmann, a continent organized like a Krupp factory, efficient, powerful, eternal." Hartmann imagined it. He believed it. June 1941. Eastern Front. The Soviet Union changed the equation, not immediately. The initial advances were spectacular. Hundreds of kilometers in weeks, millions of prisoners, the Red Army seemingly collapsing under the weight of German efficiency. But then came the mud, then came the winter, then came the terrible arithmetic of Russia. More men, more space, more time than Germany could ever account for. Hartmann learned new words. Rasputitsa, the season of mud that swallowed trucks and tanks. Frostbite, which took more men than Soviet bullets. Deep battle, the Soviet doctrine of defense that traded space for time, bleeding the Wehrmacht across endless steppes. The rations got worse. Real coffee disappeared entirely by 1942. The ersatz substitute evolved through increasingly desperate iterations. Roasted barley gave way to roasted acorns, then to chicory, then to some brown powder that tasted like mud and promises. Bread became heavier, denser, darker, more sawdust than flour. The butter ration, already meager, vanished for frontline troops. They ate hard tack and thin soup and whatever they could forage or loot. But the propaganda adapted. These weren't shortages, they were necessary concentrations of resources. Every calorie saved on the home front was a bullet for the front. Every substitution was proof of German ingenuity, overcoming Allied blockades. The Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, would endure through solidarity and sacrifice. "Look at the British," the political officers said, "starving on their island. Look at the Americans, soft, undisciplined, unable to organize their mongrel society. They have resources, yes, but they don't have our will. They don't have our system." Hartmann wanted to believe it. Most days he did believe it, because what was the alternative? To admit that everything, the sacrifices, the losses, the frozen corpses of his friends in Russian snow, was for nothing? January 1943, Stalingrad, the Sixth Army surrendered. 90,000 men marched into Soviet captivity. Most would never return. The propaganda machine worked overtime to spin the disaster. Stalingrad was a heroic last stand. The sacrifice of the Sixth Army had saved the entire Southern Front. The Führer was preparing new weapons, new strategies. The final victory was merely delayed, not denied. Hartmann, by then a seasoned Oberleutnant commanding a reconnaissance company, noticed something the propaganda couldn't hide. The material balance was shifting. Soviet T-34s appeared in greater numbers. Soviet artillery barrages lasted longer. Soviet soldiers, once poorly equipped and barely trained, now fought with American trucks, American radios, American spam. Lend-Lease. Strasser spat the word like a curse. The Americans were supplying the Soviets with mountains of equipment, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, millions of tons of food, entire railways of material. They buy their way into war while we fight it. But there was something in Strasser's voice Hartmann hadn't heard before. Doubt. Not about German courage or German skill, but about something more fundamental, about capacity, about the raw industrial mathematics that no amount of propaganda could alter. June 1944. Normandy. The Americans arrived. Hartmann's unit had been transferred west to reinforce the Atlantic Wall. When the invasion came, he watched the sky darken with aircraft, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands, wave after wave, blotting out the sun. The naval bombardment that preceded the landing was unlike anything he'd experienced. Even the worst Soviet Katyusha barrages paled in comparison. But it wasn't the firepower that shocked him. It was the waste. The Americans destroyed entire buildings to eliminate single sniper positions. They called in airstrikes on individual machine gun nests. They used artillery the way Germany used rifle ammunition, casually, constantly, without apparent concern for conservation. Hartmann watched them demolish a French village because 2 German squads were holding out in a church. The entire village, gone, just to remove an obstacle. This wasn't efficiency. This was abundance so overwhelming that efficiency became irrelevant. "They fight like they have infinite shells," one of his sergeants muttered, crouched in a crater as another barrage walked across their positions. "Like they make bullets faster than we can dodge them." The sergeant was right. Germany had mobilized every resource, every factory, every worker into total war. Women had replaced men in the factories. Teenagers and old men had been conscripted. Ersatz products had replaced ersatz products. The entire economy was a clenched fist, every ounce of strength devoted to one thing: survival. And still the Americans came with more, always more tanks, more planes, more shells, more food, more everything. December 1944, Ardennes Forest. The Ardennes Offensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge, was Germany's last major offensive in the West. Hartmann's unit participated in the initial advance. For 3 days, it felt like 1940 again. German tanks broke through American lines. Allied soldiers retreated in confusion. Maybe, just maybe, the tide could turn. Then the weather cleared. The American Air Force returned. The fighter bombers came in waves, destroying German armor with impunity. The supply lines, already stretched beyond sustainability, collapsed. The offensive stalled not because of American resistance, but because German tanks ran out of fuel. They'd gambled everything on capturing American fuel depots, and when that failed, the offensive died. Hartmann's company was cut off during the retreat. They abandoned their vehicles, no fuel, and marched west through snow and American harassment. 37 men started the march. 19 finished it. They reached German lines on Christmas Eve, frostbitten, starving, defeated. On Christmas Day, the field kitchen served them a thin soup with a few potatoes and a piece of dark bread. The political officer gave a speech about the glorious struggle, the final victory, the righteousness of their cause. No one applauded. They were too tired, too hungry, too aware that the words had become hollow. March 1945. Collapse. The Reich was dying. Not fighting, dying. The difference was crucial. Hartmann's unit retreated east, ahead of the American advance. Cities burned. Refugees clogged the roads. The Volkssturm, old men and boys with armbands and Panzerfausts, prepared to die for neighborhoods and villages that had already lost strategic meaning. The Führer issued orders from Berlin for armies that no longer existed, demanding counterattacks with divisions that had been destroyed months ago. The propaganda continued. New weapons were coming: jet fighters, miracle rockets, underground factories. The enemies would turn on each other. Victory was certain. But Hartmann could do arithmetic. The Americans were advancing 15 kilometers a day. The Soviets were approaching Berlin. Germany controlled less territory than it had in 1871. The industrial heartland was overrun. The cities were rubble. The transportation network was destroyed. It was over. The only question was how it would end. April 19, 1945, near Kassel. The order came: withdraw to defensive positions near Kassel. But there were no defensive positions. There were no reserves. There was no supply line. There was only exhaustion and the approaching rumble of American armor. Strasser gathered the remaining officers, 6 men from a company that had started the war with 40. "The war is lost," he said quietly, without ceremony or emotion, just fact. But the oath remains. We are German soldiers. We will maintain discipline to the end. And then, Hartmann asked, then we surrender with honor. They destroyed their remaining equipment, 3 half-track vehicles, some small arms, and the company records. No point in leaving intelligence for the Americans. Then they waited. The Americans arrived on April 20th, Hitler's birthday, a bitter irony not lost on anyone, a column of tanks and infantry moving with casual confidence. No preliminary bombardment, no careful probing. They simply rolled forward because nothing could stop them. Hartmann's unit raised white flags. Nobody fought. What would be the point? An American captain, probably younger than Hartmann, approached with an interpreter. "You are prisoners of war," he said in badly accented German. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Fall in and march west." That was it. No ceremony, no drama. 5 years of war ended with a short walk into captivity. April 21, 1945. Processing Center, temporary camp near Frankfurt. The first shock was the organization. German efficiency was legendary. It was a core part of national identity. The Prussian military tradition, the engineering precision, the bureaucratic thoroughness. Germany organized, Germany planned, Germany executed. But watching the Americans process prisoners was like watching a factory that happened to deal in humans instead of products. Tables set up in perfect rows, forms in multiple languages, medical checks conducted by orderlies who looked bored, photographs taken with industrial cameras, serial numbers assigned, everything documented, filed, stored, and the speed. Hartmann's group, 47 men, was fully processed in under 2 hours. 47 individuals became 47 files, became 47 numbers in a system that clearly contained tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of other numbers. "They're treating us like inventory," Strasser muttered. That was exactly what they were. Inventory. Items to be cataloged, stored, and managed. The Americans didn't seem angry or triumphant or cruel. They seemed professional. This was their job. They did it efficiently because they had systems, training, resources. The young sergeant running their processing station couldn't have been more than 22. He called out commands in broken German, ticked boxes on forms, stamped documents with rubber stamps that seemed specifically manufactured for this purpose. How many rubber stamps had the Americans made? How many forms had they printed? How much planning had gone into processing captured enemy soldiers at industrial scale? Name? Hartmann Klaus, Oberleutnant. Service number? He provided it. The sergeant wrote it down without looking up, compared it to some central list, made a check mark. Medical conditions? Frostbite, left foot, 3 years ago. Check mark? Next question. Next check mark. Next prisoner. They were given clean uniforms, American ones, dyed brown to distinguish POWs from active soldiers. The uniforms fit. How did they fit? Had the Americans manufactured prison uniforms in every conceivable size, just in case? The pants Hartmann received were slightly loose in the waist, but perfect in length. Someone had planned for this. Someone had thought, we will capture hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, and they will need clothes, so let's manufacture clothes in advance, in every size, warehoused and ready for distribution. The Wehrmacht had barely managed to keep its own soldiers in boots. April 23, 1945. Transport train to Camp Concordia, Kansas. The train that took them west was designed for freight but modified for passengers. Wooden benches had been installed, ventilation grates added, a water tank at each car. Nothing comfortable, but nothing cruel either. Functional, adequate, efficient. German trains by 1945 barely ran. The rails were bombed. The locomotives were destroyed. The ones that still operated carried military supplies and little else. Civilian travel had virtually ceased. Even military trains moved slowly, stopping frequently to repair damage, reroute around destroyed sections, wait for clearance. This American train moved at speed, constant speed, through the night, through the next day, through the next night. The rhythm was almost hypnotic. Click, clack, click, clack, click, clack. The sound of infrastructure that worked, that hadn't been bombed, that stretched across an entire continent uninterrupted. They crossed into France. Hartmann watched through the small window. Even French trains were running. American organized French trains carrying American supplies, running on schedules established by American logistics officers. The Germans had occupied France for 4 years and never made the trains run this efficiently. At stops, American military police handed out rations through the doors. Not hot food, crackers, cheese, canned meat, chocolate. The chocolate caught everyone's attention. Real chocolate, not the ersatz garbage made from who knows what that Germany had passed off as chocolate since 1941. American soldiers distributed it like it meant nothing, like chocolate was an afterthought, barely worth mentioning. "They give this to prisoners," one German corporal said, holding the chocolate bar as if it might be a trick. "What do they eat themselves?" Nobody had an answer. The train reached a port, Le Havre. They'd heard about Le Havre. The British and Americans had bombed it heavily during the Normandy campaign, destroying most of the city. Hartmann expected ruins. Instead, he saw cranes, hundreds of them, massive steel structures extending from reconstructed piers into the harbor, each lifting cargo containers from ships that seemed to arrive in endless succession. The harbor was more active than any German port had been even in peacetime, more active than any industrial site Hartmann had seen anywhere in Europe. And this was supposedly a destroyed city, recently liberated in a war zone. They loaded onto a ship, the USS General Mitchell, a troop transport that could carry 5,000 men. 5,000. The Bismarck, pride of the Kriegsmarine, had carried just over 2,000 crew. This ship, one of dozens visible in the harbor, was bigger, and it was designed just to move people around, not to fight, not to make strategic impact, just to transport. How many ships did the Americans have? April 29, 1945. Atlantic crossing. The Atlantic took 6 days. The voyage was monotonous but revealing. They ate twice daily in shifts. 500 men at a time cycled through mess halls. The food was bland but abundant. Bread, butter, real butter, soup, meat, canned vegetables, coffee, real coffee. Not German coffee or even French coffee, but coffee, dark, bitter, genuine. "I haven't tasted real coffee since 1942, Strasser said, staring at his cup. "I haven't tasted this much food since 1942, Hartmann replied. And that was the thing, the quantity. German soldiers had lived on increasingly meager rations for years. By 1945, a frontline soldier received maybe 2,000 calories daily when supplies arrived on schedule, which they rarely did. Civilian rations in German cities had dropped to 2,200 calories or less. Starvation wasn't universal, but hunger was. These American military rations probably provided 3,500 calories for prisoners, for defeated enemies who had tried to kill Americans just weeks earlier. Why? The simple answer was the Geneva Convention. The Americans followed rules. But that explanation felt inadequate. Following rules required surplus. It required an economy that could afford to feed enemy prisoners according to international standards while fighting a global war on multiple continents while maintaining civilian prosperity at home. Germany couldn't feed its own people while fighting that same war. On the third day at sea, an American chaplain came through offering services for anyone interested. Protestant, Catholic, even Jewish. They had all three. Voluntary attendance, no pressure, no political officers watching to ensure compliance. Just options. Hartmann attended the Catholic service out of curiosity. The chaplain, Captain Marcus Sullivan, according to his name tag, spoke in English, but an interpreter provided German translation. The message was standard wartime Christianity: faith in dark times, hope for the future, pray for peace, remember that God loves even enemies. What struck Hartmann was the casualness. The chaplain clearly believed what he preached, but he didn't preach like the world was ending. He didn't have the desperate intensity of German religious services circa 1945, where priests and pastors grasped at faith like drowning men grasped at driftwood. Sullivan preached like a man who expected tomorrow to be better than today, who assumed his audience would survive to see peace. Afterward, Hartmann asked through the interpreter, "Why do Americans fight?" Sullivan looked surprised by the question. "For freedom," he said, as if it were obvious. "To stop aggression, to protect democracy." "But why do you fight so well? Why are you winning?" The chaplain paused. "I'm not a general, Lieutenant, but I'd say we fight because we believe in what we're fighting for, and we have the resources to back that belief." Resources? Always resources. May 5, 1945, New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty emerged from morning fog like a revelation. Hartmann had seen photographs, of course. Everyone had. But photographs didn't capture the scale. The statue towered over the harbor, torch raised, crown gleaming copper green in the dawn light. Behind it, Manhattan's skyline rose in impossible vertical profusion, buildings taller than Germany's tallest church spires, clustered so densely they seemed to form a single massive monument to ambition. The ship's loudspeakers crackled. Prisoners will remain below deck during docking procedures. But everyone crowded near portholes anyway, desperate to see, to understand. The harbor was full of ships. Not warships. Cargo vessels, passenger liners, tugboats, ferries, hundreds of craft moving in complex choreography without colliding, without slowing, without apparent coordination, yet somehow perfectly organized. And beyond the harbor, the city itself seemed alive in a way that no German city had been alive in years. Lights. Everywhere lights. Even in daylight, the city glowed with electric advertisement, with commerce, with activity. "This is the enemy," Strasser said quietly. "This is what we were fighting." This was what propaganda had called weak, decadent, mongrelized, chaotic, inefficient. This was what the Reich claimed to surpass, to defeat, to replace with German superiority. Hartmann said nothing. What could he say? That they'd been lied to? Everyone already knew that the war had been unwinnable from the start. Perhaps. That everything, all the sacrifice, all the death, had been for nothing? That truth was too large to speak aloud, too devastating to acknowledge. So he just watched the city recede as their train carried them inland. West? Always west. Away from Europe, away from war, toward whatever came next. May 7, 1945, somewhere in Pennsylvania. The train passed through a town, Hartmann didn't catch the name, somewhere in Pennsylvania's coal country, mid-sized, unremarkable. It was 4 p.m. Factories were letting out shifts. Workers flooded the streets, thousands of them carrying lunch pails, walking home. The town had a main street with shops displaying goods in windows. Cars, dozens of cars, drove through intersections. Children played in parks. Women pushed strollers. Everything looked normal. "They're not at war," one of the younger soldiers said, face pressed against the window. But they were at war. America had millions of men in uniform fighting across 2 oceans. American factories produced more tanks than all of Germany's industry combined. American shipyards launched a new destroyer every week. America was prosecuting the largest military campaign in human history. And this town looked like peace. That was the real shock. Not that America was powerful, they'd learned that on the battlefield, but that America was powerful without total mobilization, without total sacrifice, without the complete sublimation of civilian life to military necessity that had defined Germany since 1939. These workers were making weapons. The factories they left were undoubtedly producing something for the war effort, but they went home at 5 p.m. They bought goods in shops. They lived normal lives. War was something that happened elsewhere, something that didn't require them to give up everything. Germany had given up everything and lost. America had given up very little and won. The arithmetic was devastating. May 8, 1945, Camp Concordia, Kansas. They arrived at Camp Concordia on the day Germany surrendered. The timing felt symbolic. The war in Europe was over. Germany had ceased to exist as a state. The Führer was dead. Suicide in his bunker, though they wouldn't learn details until later. Everything they'd fought for had collapsed into rubble and recrimination. And they were in Kansas. Kansas, the geographic and psychological center of nowhere, the heart of American agricultural abundance, flat and endless, and so far from Europe that the war might as well have happened on another planet. Camp Concordia was huge, not brutal, huge. Rows of barracks extending to the horizon. Watchtowers staffed by guards who looked more bored than vigilant. Wire fencing that seemed almost apologetic, as if the camp wanted to pretend it wasn't a prison. The commandant, Colonel James Harrison, addressed the new arrivals through interpreters. He was probably 50, with the soft, middle-aged paunch that comes from desk work and regular meals. He looked like someone's genial uncle, not a jailer. "Gentlemen," he said, and the word was jarring. Gentlemen, not prisoners, not enemies. Gentlemen. "The war in Europe is over. You will be held here until repatriation arrangements can be made. While here, you will be treated in accordance with international law. You will receive adequate food, medical care, and accommodation. You will not be forced to work, though voluntary labor opportunities are available for those who wish to earn privileges. Questions will be answered by your barrack leaders. Dismissed." That was it. No speech about German crimes. No threats. No triumphalism. Just administration. They were assigned barracks, 12 men to a room designed for 12, with individual cots and blankets. The barracks were wooden, but weather-proofed and clean. Heating stoves sat ready for winter, though it was May. Communal washrooms featured running water, hot and cold, toilets that flushed, electric lights. Hartmann sat on his assigned cot and tried to process it. This was a prison. They were prisoners. This should be punishment. Instead, it was better than any billet he'd had in the Wehrmacht since 1941. May 9th, 1945, first morning, Camp Concordia. The wake-up bell rang at 6:30 a.m. Not a guard shouting, not a gunshot. A bell like a school bell, pleasant and ordinary. Breakfast was at 6:30. They formed up by barracks and marched to mess halls, except it wasn't really marching. Walking in formation, loosely supervised, no weapons pointed at them. The American guards chatted with each other, ignored the prisoners unless someone needed direction. The mess hall was the first real shock. It seated 500. Long tables with attached benches, cafeteria-style service, American pop music playing from loudspeakers. The music was jarring, big band swing, cheerful and upbeat, as if the building wanted everyone to forget they were in a prison camp in the middle of Kansas. The food arrived on metal trays divided into sections: scrambled eggs, sausage, fried potatoes, bread with butter, orange juice, coffee, real food, hot food. Food in quantities that suggested the cooks had made too much rather than too little. Hartmann stared at his tray. The last time he'd seen this much protein in one meal was... when? France? In 1940? Before that? "Is this a trick?" someone asked. Strasser, sitting across from him, cut into his sausage. "It's not a trick. It's breakfast. For prisoners. For us." They ate in silence. What do you say when your enemy feeds you better than your own country did? When the food itself becomes a weapon more devastating than artillery? After breakfast, they returned to barracks for roll call. An American lieutenant, barely old enough to shave, read names from a clipboard. Everyone present. Good. Dismissed until lunch. Dismissed. Not assigned to labor details, not locked in cells. Dismissed. Like they were soldiers on leave rather than captured enemies. "What do we do?" one of the younger soldiers asked Hartmann. "I don't know. Wait, I suppose." Waiting turned out to be complicated. May 10th, 1945, the canteen. The canteen opened at 10 a.m. Nobody had mentioned it during orientation. Someone just noticed other prisoners walking toward a building near the center of camp and followed out of curiosity. Word spread. Soon dozens, then hundreds of men clustered outside what looked like a large recreation hall. An American sergeant stood at the door. "Canteen privileges for prisoners with camp scrip. You can earn script through voluntary work details. First-time visitors get 5 script to start. Enter in groups of 50. Hartmann's group was third. They filed in. The interior looked like a small store, shelves stocked with goods, a counter with American staff, price lists on the wall in German and English, and the goods themselves: cigarettes, candy, soap, toothpaste, razors, writing paper, magazines, books, and Coca-Cola. Bottles of Coca-Cola, lined up in a metal cooler, condensation frosting the glass. Ice. The cooler had ice, in the middle of Kansas, in a prison camp. For prisoners. The American running the counter, a middle-aged sergeant with thinning hair, smiled like a shopkeeper rather than a guard. 5 script gets you a pack of cigarettes or 3 Coca-Colas. Prices are on the wall. Everything's available except alcohol and weapons. Obviously. Obviously. Hartmann approached the counter, handed over his 5 script chits. Coca-Cola. The sergeant pulled 3 bottles from the cooler, popped the caps with a wall-mounted opener, and handed them over. Enjoy. Enjoy? The bottle was colder than anything Hartmann had touched in years. The condensation ran over his fingers. The liquid inside was dark, mysterious, foreign. He raised it to his lips. The taste was indescribable. Sweet, but not cloying. Carbonated with bubbles that exploded on his tongue. Slightly acidic, complex in ways ersatz anything never was. It was cold, and it was real, and it was available in a prison camp in quantities that suggested infinite supply. He finished the first bottle in 3 long pulls, started the second, slower this time, trying to understand. Around him other prisoners were having similar experiences. Grown men, veterans of the Eastern Front, stood drinking Coca-Cola like children tasting candy for the first time. Some laughed, some cried. Most just stared at their bottles with expressions of confused wonder. Strasser appeared beside him, holding his own bottle. Do you understand what this means? That Americans have good logistics? That Americans have resources so overwhelming they can afford to give luxury goods to prisoners? Not just afford. They've institutionalized it. They've built systems specifically to provide these things to captured enemies. This isn't battlefield supply. This isn't military rations. This is Coca-Cola in a prison camp in Kansas. Hartmann looked at his second bottle. The propaganda said Americans were weak. The propaganda lied. The propaganda said American industry was inefficient. The propaganda lied about that too. The propaganda lied about everything, Klaus, everything. We fought a country that makes fizzy sugar water for fun. While we were rationing potatoes, they were building refrigeration units for prison camps. While we were converting everything to war production, they were keeping their civilian economy running. While we were screaming about total mobilization and total sacrifice, they were fighting us, part-time. The bottle seemed heavier suddenly. Not physically, psychologically. This wasn't just a drink. It was evidence. Proof. An indictment not just of Germany's strategic decisions, but of the entire ideological framework that had justified those decisions. I need to sit down, Hartmann said. They found a bench outside the canteen. The Kansas afternoon was warm, almost pleasant. Clouds drifted across a sky so big it seemed to have no edges. Somewhere in the distance, a baseball game was happening. American guards playing against each other, their shouts and laughter carrying across the camp. What do we tell the men? Strasser asked quietly. The truth. That we lost. That we never had a chance. That everything we believed was wrong. They know we lost, but accepting that we never could have won? That's different. That means all the sacrifice was for nothing. Yes. They sat in silence. The Coca-Cola bottle sweated in Hartmann's hand. Behind them, prisoners continued to file in and out of the canteen, each emerging with the same stunned expression, each holding evidence of their complete misunderstanding of the war they'd just lost. May 15, 1945, work detail, voluntary work details paid in camp scrip. The Americans needed labor, fields to tend, maintenance to perform, kitchens to staff. They offered payment, 1 scrip per hour with higher rates for skilled work. It was strange applying for jobs as a prisoner. Stranger still that the Americans seemed to care about qualifications. Engineers got better pay than laborers. Mechanics could earn double rates. The system was capitalistic even here, even in captivity. Hartmann volunteered for the motor pool. His engineering background made him valuable. The American sergeant in charge, a practical man named Morrison who'd been a Ford mechanic in Detroit, assessed his skills, asked questions about engine repair, and assigned him to work on camp vehicles. The motor pool contained 20 trucks. 20. For one prison camp, all in working order, all with spare parts available. Morrison showed Hartmann the supply room, shelves of filters, belts, gaskets, spark plugs, every component needed to keep vehicles running. "We get requisitions filled in 2 weeks," Morrison explained. "Sometimes faster. Just fill out the form, submit to logistics, wait for delivery." 2 weeks. In Germany by 1944, requisitions took months if they arrived at all. The Wehrmacht had cannibalized broken vehicles to keep others running. They'd manufactured parts in field workshops using scrap metal and desperation, and here was a prison camp receiving engine parts on schedule. "Why so many trucks?" Hartmann asked. Morrison shrugged. "Need them. Supply runs, personnel transport, maintenance crews. Can't run a facility this size without proper mobility. Can't run a facility this size, as if the camp were a factory or a business, requiring efficiency and planning, which Hartmann realized it was. The Americans ran prison camps the way they ran everything else, systematically with proper resources, assuming success rather than managing failure. He worked 4 hours that day. Morrison paid him 4 scrip at the end, marked his hours in a logbook, told him to come back tomorrow if he wanted. Transactional, professional, strange. May 20th, 1945. Letters home. The camp had a post office. Not just a box where you dropped letters, hoping they'd reach somewhere eventually. A real post office with staff, forms, regulations, and actual delivery service. Prisoners could write home once a week, 2 pages maximum, subject to censorship. But real mail service to Germany, or what was left of Germany. Hartmann sat in the recreation hall with blank paper and a pen provided free by the camp. "What do you write? What do you say to family if they're still alive about where you are and what you've learned?" He started 3 times, crossed out 3 times. Finally, "Dear Mother, I am alive and unheld. I am in America, in a place called Kansas. We are treated well. Better than well. I have enough food, clean water, a bed. We receive medical care. The Americans follow the rules. The war is over. Germany has surrendered. I don't know what remains of home or if this letter will reach you. If it does, please respond. I need to know you survived. I cannot write what I feel. The censors would not allow it. But I will say this. Everything was lies. Everything. We were told America was weak. Mother, they give us Coca-Cola. In prison camps. They have so much of everything that they give luxury goods to prisoners. I don't know when I'll come home. I don't know if there is a home to come to. But I am alive. Remember that. Your son, Klaus." He submitted it to the postal clerk, another American sergeant who stamped it, assigned a tracking number, told him it would be sent to the Red Cross for processing and delivery. "How long?" Hartmann asked. "To Germany. Could be months. The situation there is complicated, but it'll get there eventually. We've got good tracking." Good tracking. For prisoner mail. To a defeated enemy country. Around him, other prisoners wrote similar letters. Some in German, some in Polish. There were Polish soldiers who'd been conscripted by the Wehrmacht. A few in Russian, Soviet citizens forced to fight. The Americans processed them all, sorted them all, maintained records of them all. The infrastructure required was staggering. This wasn't just one camp. There were hundreds of camps across America, each holding thousands of prisoners, each with postal service, canteens, medical facilities, recreational opportunities. Someone had planned for this. Someone had built systems to manage captured enemies at industrial scale with bureaucratic precision and surprising humanity. May 25, 1945. The library. The camp had a library. Hartmann discovered it by accident following signs in German and English to a building he'd assumed was administrative. Inside, books. Thousands of books. German books, English books, French books, fiction, history, technical manuals, newspapers, magazines. An American corporal sat at the front desk, reading. He looked up when Hartmann entered. "Checking out books?" "I can do that?" "Sure, 3 books maximum, 2-week loan, just sign the card." The corporal handed him a form. Hartmann wandered the shelves, stunned. Technical engineering texts, German classics, Goethe, Schiller, Mann, American novels translated into German, even newspapers, American papers with articles about the war's end, about Germany's surrender, about the occupation. He pulled a technical manual on diesel engines, an English language newspaper from New York, and, almost by accident, a thin volume of poetry by Heinrich Heine, a German Jewish poet banned by the Nazis. The corporal processed his selections without comment. Due back June 8th. Enjoy. That night, Hartmann read by electric light in his barrack. The newspaper described the German surrender in detail. The pictures showed Berlin in ruins. Hitler's suicide confirmed. The complete collapse of central authority. Germany divided into occupation zones, American, British, French, Soviet. The poetry was harder. Heine had been forbidden for 12 years. Reading him felt transgressive, dangerous, even though the danger was gone, even though the regime that had banned him was dust. One poem caught his attention. "Denk ich an Deutschland in der Nacht, dann bin ich den Schlaf gebracht." When I think of Germany in the night, then sleep abandons me. Written in 1843, still true in 1945. Different reasons, same insomnia. June 1st, 1945. The baseball game. The Americans organized a baseball game between prisoners and guards. It started as a joke, some American lieutenant suggesting it to boost morale. But the camp commander approved. Equipment appeared. Bats, balls, gloves, bases. An announcer system set up near the field. Bleachers assembled. Most German prisoners had never seen baseball. The rules seemed incomprehensible. But the Americans were enthusiastic teachers. They explained innings, strikes, home runs. They demonstrated batting and pitching. They divided prisoners into teams, mixed in American players to help, and started a game. It was absurd. Grown men playing children's games while Europe burned, while millions were dead, while civilization lay in ruins. And yet, the crack of bat on ball, the sprint to first base, the Americans cheering when a German prisoner hit a double, the prisoners laughing when an American guard struck out. For 3 hours, they weren't captors and captured. They were just men playing a game on a spring afternoon in Kansas. Hartmann played right field. He was terrible, missed 2 catches. But nobody seemed to care. The American shortstop, a kid from Michigan who'd landed at Normandy, helped him with his stance, showed him how to track the ball, patted his shoulder when he finally caught a fly ball. "Nice catch, buddy." Buddy. The game ended with the Americans winning 8-7. Everyone shook hands. The camp commander announced that baseball would become a regular activity. More equipment was being ordered. Walking back to barracks, Strasser shook his head. "They're trying to Americanize us." "Maybe," Hartmann said, "or maybe they're just being American." "What's the difference?" "Americans assume everyone wants to be American. Germans assumed everyone should be German. One is annoying, the other is genocidal." Strasser had no answer to that. June 10th, 1945. The movie. The camp had a theater. Once a week they showed movies, American films with German subtitles. The first screening was a Western, Stagecoach with John Wayne. Simple plot, cowboys, Indians, shootouts, heroism, classic American mythology. But it wasn't the content that struck Hartmann. It was the fact of it, that America had an entertainment industry so robust it mass-produced fantasies, that this industry continued operating during total war, that the military considered movies important enough to provide them to prison camps. The production values were extraordinary. The cinematography, the editing, the sound quality, everything polished to perfection. This wasn't propaganda. Or rather, it was propaganda so sophisticated it didn't feel like propaganda. It was just a story. But the story assumed American values were universal: individualism, courage, redemption, the frontier spirit. After the film, prisoners discussed it in barracks. Some dismissed it as shallow nonsense. Others found it fascinating. One former schoolteacher analyzed it like literature, identifying themes and symbols. "It's mythology," he said. "Every culture has mythology. Cowboys are their knights. The West is their frontier of possibility. The story reinforces values: individualism over collectivism, redemption over predestination, action over contemplation." "Is it effective?" someone asked. "We're here, aren't we? Analyzing it, thinking about it. That's effectiveness." June 15, 1945, medical care. Private Zimmerman collapsed during roll call. He'd been sick for days, some kind of respiratory infection he'd tried to ignore. But by morning, he couldn't stand. Other prisoners carried him to the camp infirmary. Hartmann went with him. The infirmary was clean, well lit, fully stocked. American medics examined Zimmerman immediately. No waiting, no forms, no questions about whether he deserved treatment. "Pneumonia," the doctor said. Captain Anderson, a soft-spoken man from Minnesota. "Serious but treatable. We'll keep him here, administer sulfa drugs, monitor his condition." "Will he live?" Hartmann asked. Anderson looked surprised by the question. "Of course he'll live. It's pneumonia, not cancer. Give us a week." A week later, Zimmerman returned to barracks. Recovered. Healthy. He'd been given antibiotics, sulfa drugs that Germany had developed but could never produce in sufficient quantities. The Americans had them in surplus. They gave them to prisoners, obviously. The contrast was devastating. German military medicine by 1945 had regressed to World War I standards. Soldiers died from infections that should have been treatable. They underwent amputations without anesthesia. They suffered because resources didn't exist. Here, in a prison camp, enemy soldiers received better medical care than Wehrmacht troops had received at the front. "They save everyone," Zimmerman said quietly. "Even us. Even after everything." "Maybe especially after everything," Hartmann replied. July 4, 1945, Independence Day. The Americans celebrated their Independence Day with typical American excess: barbecue, music, games, fireworks. The prison camp became a festival ground. Prisoners were invited, encouraged to participate. Extra food prepared. A band played patriotic American songs that meant nothing to the Germans, but everything to the guards. The camp commander, Colonel Harrison, gave a speech. An interpreter translated, "Today we celebrate freedom, not just American freedom, but the idea of freedom. The war we just won was fought against tyranny. Many of you fought for that tyranny. You were soldiers following orders. We understand that. We also believe that given freedom, given opportunity, given dignity, men will choose better. That's why we treat you as we do. Not because you earned it, but because dignity is not earned. It's inherent. We're showing you what freedom looks like, what democracy provides, what peace can build. Some of you will return to Germany. When you do, remember this. Remember that former enemies can become friends. Remember that strength doesn't require cruelty. Remember that abundance is possible without conquest. The speech was propaganda, but it was also true. That was the insidious thing. American propaganda worked because it was backed by evidence. The food was real. The Coca-Cola was real. The medical care was real. The baseball games were real. The fireworks started at dusk. Colors exploding across the Kansas sky. Red, white, blue, gold. Purely decorative. Purely for celebration. A nation at war spending resources on aesthetic experiences for captured enemies. Hartmann watched them with mixed feelings. Wonder at the beauty, bitterness at the contrast, grief for everything lost, and something else, something harder to name. Hope, maybe, or the possibility of hope. July 20th, 1945. The discussion. Groups formed naturally among prisoners, some clustered by unit, former comrades maintaining bonds, others by region, Bavarians with Bavarians, Prussians with Prussians, still others by ideology, the die-hard Nazis kept apart from doubters, communists separated from both. Hartmann's group was eclectic. Strasser, Zimmermann, a former university professor named Kellerman, a mechanic named Schmidt, a farmer named Bauer. They met evenings in the recreation hall, ostensibly to play cards, but really to talk. "What happens when we go back?" Schmidt asked one night. "Assuming there's a back to go to," Kellerman said. The professor had a dark sense of humor. "Germany still exists," Strasser said. "In ruins, occupied, but it exists." "As what?" Hartmann asked. "A nation? A territory? A memory?" "As whatever we make it," Bauer said. The farmer was surprisingly philosophical. "We lost the war, but we don't have to lose the peace." "The peace is being dictated to us," Schmidt pointed out. "The Allies will decide what Germany becomes." "Then we adapt," Kellerman said. "We've learned adaptation here, haven't we? The Americans have shown us a different way. Democracy, capitalism, individual freedom. Maybe those aren't just American values. Maybe they're simply values." "Careful," Strasser warned. "That sounds dangerously close to collaboration." "Collaboration with what?" Kellerman challenged. "The Reich is gone. Hitler is dead. What are we being loyal to? Ashes?" Silence. Finally Hartmann spoke. "I think we were loyal to an idea that never existed. The propaganda promised strength through unity, prosperity through conquest, glory through sacrifice, but all we got was death. All we built was graves." "So what do we replace it with?" Zimmermann asked. "I don't know, but I know what it looks like. It looks like this." Hartmann gestured around the recreation hall. Prisoners reading books, playing chess, writing letters. Normal life, peaceful life. "It looks like societies wealthy enough to be generous. It looks like systems that assume human dignity rather than demanding it be earned." "You're describing America," Schmidt said. "I'm describing civilization. America just happens to exemplify it right now." "After they bombed our cities to rubble," Strasser added bitterly. "After we started a war that killed 60 million people," Hartmann countered. "Yes, Werner. After we did that, they still feed us, still give us Coca-Cola, still treat us like humans. Maybe that's the point." The conversation continued into the night. No conclusions, just questions. But questions were progress. Questions meant thinking, and thinking meant moving beyond the certainties that had led them here. August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb. News reached the camp through American newspapers. Atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. A single bomb. An entire city destroyed. Casualties estimated in the tens of thousands. A weapon beyond comprehension. The prisoners gathered around posted newspaper articles, reading in stunned silence. The photographs showed devastation that made Dresden look minor. The description spoke of heat that vaporized humans, of radiation that killed days later, of power equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT in a device that fit on one airplane. "Mein Gott," Kellerman whispered. "What have they done?" "What we would have done," Hartmann said quietly, "if we'd developed it first." It was true. Germany had pursued atomic research, had failed or been too slow or lacked resources. But the intention was there. The willingness to use such weapons was never in doubt. "This changes everything," Strasser said. "No," Hartmann replied. "This confirms everything. We were fighting a country that could split atoms while we were running out of fuel. The gap wasn't military. It was civilizational. They're not just ahead of us technologically. They're ahead of us conceptually. They think in terms we can't even imagine." 3 days later, Nagasaki. Another bomb. Another city gone. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. Completely. Finally. That night, prisoners sat in silent contemplation. Some prayed. Some wept. Some just stared into distance, processing the implications. The atomic bomb was terrifying. But it was also clarifying. You couldn't fight that. You couldn't resist that. You could only accept that the world had changed, that certain nations had power beyond comprehension, and that perhaps submission to that power was less shameful than continued resistance. September 1945. Re-education. The Americans started educational programs, not propaganda, at least not explicitly, classes in English, lectures on American history, discussions of democracy. Films about the liberation of concentration camps. The camp films were the hardest. Footage from Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz. Bodies stacked like cordwood, living skeletons, mass graves, industrial-scale death. "Did you know?" the American lecturer asked Major Thompson, a former history teacher from Boston. "Did German soldiers know what was happening?" The room was silent. "Some of us heard rumors," Kellerman finally said, "but we didn't believe them. We thought it was Allied propaganda." "And now?" "Now we know the propaganda was true." Thompson nodded. "That's the first step. Knowledge. You can't unknow what you've seen. You can't pretend it didn't happen. Germany did this. Not just Hitler, not just the SS. Germany, the nation, the culture, the people. You." "I didn't kill anyone in a camp," Schmidt protested. "No, you just fought for the regime that built them. You wore the uniform that protected them. You believed the lies that enabled them. It was harsh, but it was also necessary. The comfortable distance between soldiers and war criminals was artificial. Everyone had participated. Everyone bore responsibility. The question wasn't guilt. That was obvious. The question was what came after guilt." Thompson continued, "But guilt without action is just self-pity. You can't undo the past. You can only build a different future. That's why you're here. That's why we're teaching you. Because Germany needs to be rebuilt, and it needs to be rebuilt by Germans who understand what went wrong. The re-education program was intensive. 3 classes per week. Voluntary attendance, but social pressure to participate. The Americans were thorough. They wanted to reshape German consciousness, to replace Nazi ideology with democratic values. It was colonization through education. It was also salvation." October 1945. The letter. Hartmann received a reply from his mother. The envelope was battered, forwarded through multiple channels, finally reaching Kansas 4 months after he'd sent his original letter. His hand shook opening it. "My dear Klaus, I cannot express my relief at learning you are alive and safe. We received your letter through the Red Cross. It is a miracle. Home is gone. Our house in Essen was destroyed in the bombing. I survived by luck. I was visiting your aunt in the countryside when the raid came. I live with her now. There is no city to return to. Essen is rubble. The Krupp works are ruins. Everything is gone. Your father did not survive. He died in January during the final Soviet offensive. I only learned this in May. I am sorry to tell you like this, in a letter, across such distance. But you deserve to know. You mention lies. You are right. We were lied to about everything, but we also lied to ourselves. We saw what we wanted to see. We believed what was comfortable to believe. We are all guilty. All of us. I don't know when you will return or what you will return to. Germany is occupied, divided, destroyed. But it is still home. When you come back, we will rebuild. What else can we do? Stay safe. Stay strong. Come home when you can. Your loving mother Hartmann read it 3 times. His father was dead. His home was rubble. Germany was gone. But his mother survived. His aunt survived. Life continued, even in ruins. He sat on his cot with the letter in his hands and cried. Not for Germany. Germany had earned its fate. For his father, who'd been a decent man trapped in an indecent system. For his mother, who'd lost everything. For himself, who'd survived, but didn't know what he'd survived for. Strasser found him there, said nothing, just sat beside him. Sometimes silence was the only appropriate response. November 1945. The decision. The Americans offered opportunities. Skilled prisoners could apply for work programs in America, engineers especially, mechanics, technicians. The offer came with conditions: renounce Nazi ideology, accept democratic values, commit to peaceful citizenship. It was a test and an opportunity. They want to drain Germany of talent, Strasser said when he heard. Or they want to give Germans a future, Hartmann countered. You're thinking of staying? I'm thinking of surviving. If I go back to Germany, what awaits? Ruins, occupation, poverty, guilt. Here I could work, rebuild a life, maybe even help rebuild Germany from outside. That's rationalization. Maybe. Or maybe it's adaptation. The Americans won just because they had more tanks. They won because they built a society worth living in. Maybe we should learn from that. Several prisoners applied. Hartmann was among them. The application required essays, interviews, background checks. The Americans were thorough. They wanted to ensure they weren't importing war criminals or ideological diehards. Hartmann's engineering background helped. His lack of Nazi Party membership helped more. He'd been a soldier, not a believer. That distinction mattered. In December, he received approval, conditional residency, work permit for a civil engineering firm in Chicago, renewable based on conduct and employment. Chicago, a city he'd never seen, in a country he'd been trying to kill just months earlier, starting over at age 32 with nothing but skills and a willingness to forget. December 24, 1945, Christmas Eve. The camp held a Christmas celebration. Both Christian traditions, Catholic and Protestant, were honored. Prisoners could attend services. A chapel had been set up in one of the recreation buildings. Hartmann attended the Catholic Mass. The chaplain, not Sullivan, but a replacement, Father O'Brien, delivered a sermon about forgiveness and redemption, about how Christ came to save sinners, not the righteous, about how the worst sins could be forgiven if truly repented. It was standard theology, but it felt personal, specific, directed at men who'd participated in terrible things and now sought absolution. God forgives, O'Brien said, but forgiveness requires acknowledgement. You must face what you did, what you enabled, what you failed to prevent. You must own that, and then you must choose differently. Choose differently. After Mass, the camp served a Christmas meal. Turkey, stuffing, potatoes, vegetables, pie. Christmas carols played over loudspeakers, American songs, German songs, universal melodies. Hartmann sat with his usual group. They ate in silence, each lost in thoughts of previous Christmases. 1944 in the Ardennes, 1943 on the Eastern Front, 1940 in occupied France, 1939 at home when the war was new and victory seemed certain. Next year, Bauer said quietly, we'll be somewhere else. Where? Schmidt asked. I don't know, but not here. This is temporary. All of this is temporary. We're between lives, between worlds. Next year we'll have to choose who we become. I've already chosen, Hartmann said. I'm going to Chicago, going to build bridges in America, going to forget I was ever German. You can't forget, Strasser said. You can only move forward. Then that's what I'll do. They raised their coffee cups, not Coca-Cola tonight, but real coffee, hot and bitter, a toast to the future, to survival, to the possibility of redemption. January 1946, departure. The selected prisoners left in groups. Hartmann's group, 17 men, all approved for work programs, departed Camp Concordia on a cold January morning. They traveled by bus to Kansas City, then by train to Chicago. The journey took 2 days. Hartmann watched America pass by the window. Endless farmland, small towns, industrial cities, all intact, all functioning, all untouched by war. Chicago appeared on the horizon like something from science fiction, skyscrapers piercing low clouds, the lake stretching to infinity, traffic and commerce and life at scales that made German cities seem quaint. They were met by representatives from the work program, processed again, given civilian clothes, American clothes off the rack but fitting reasonably well, assigned temporary housing, connected with employers. The efficiency was characteristic. These Americans organized integration the way they organized everything, systematically with proper resources, assuming success. Hartmann's employer was Morris & Bradley Engineering, a civil engineering firm specializing in infrastructure. The interview was brief. "Can you design a bridge?" the senior partner asked. "Yes." "Can you follow American engineering standards?" "I can learn." "Can you work with a team that includes Jews, blacks, and women?" "Yes." "Then welcome aboard. You start Monday." That's simple. The war mattered less than competence. His nationality mattered less than his skills. America was pragmatic. America needed engineers. He was an engineer. Transaction complete, March 1946, first project. His first project was a highway bridge in Indiana. Nothing glamorous. Span over a small river. Standard design, but real work. Meaningful work. The team included 8 engineers. One was Jewish, Goldstein, whose family had fled Berlin in 1936. They worked together without incident. Goldstein knew Hartmann had fought for Germany. Hartmann knew Goldstein's relatives had likely died in camps. They didn't discuss it. They designed bridges. "You're good," Goldstein said one day, reviewing Hartmann's calculations. "Better than good. Where'd you learn?" "Berlin, Technical University, class of 35. "I applied there, didn't get in. Quotas, you know." "I know, I'm sorry." "Why?" "You didn't make the rules." "I didn't oppose them either." Goldstein shrugged. "Most people didn't. That's how it works. Evil doesn't need active support. Passive acceptance is enough." They returned to their calculations. The bridge would support 50-ton loads. It would last 50 years. It would connect people across a river. Not redemption exactly. But contribution, building instead of destroying. June 1946, citizenship application. Hartmann applied for American citizenship. The process took years, but starting it felt important. A statement of intention, a commitment to something beyond temporary residence. The application required another essay. Why do you want to become an American citizen? He wrote honestly, "I want to become American because America represents what Germany could have been if we'd chosen differently. You built a society based on principles rather than blood. You created wealth through production rather than conquest. You offer freedom rather than demanding loyalty. These aren't uniquely American values, they're human values. But America enacted them. Germany failed to. I can't undo what Germany did. I can't bring back the dead or rebuild the destroyed cities. But I can choose what comes next. I choose America. I choose democracy. I choose to build rather than destroy. I'm not running from Germany. I'm running toward something better." The immigration officer who reviewed his application asked one question. "Do you renounce all loyalty to Germany?" "I renounce loyalty to the Germany that was. I mourn for the Germany that could have been." "That's not what I asked." "Yes, I renounce it. Completely." "Good enough." September 1946. The store. Hartmann walked into a supermarket for the first time. He'd seen such stores from outside, bright, spacious, crowded with shoppers. But entering felt transgressive, as if prisoners turned immigrants shouldn't have access to such abundance. The interior was overwhelming. Aisles stretching into distance, shelves stacked with products in varieties that seemed excessive. 20 types of bread, 30 types of cereal, produce from across the continent, all fresh, all available simultaneously. He wandered in a daze, picked up a can of soup, put it down, picked up coffee, real coffee, multiple brands, different roasts and prices. Picked up Coca-Cola, cases of it, unlimited supply, available to anyone with money. A woman saw him standing paralyzed in the beverage aisle. "First time shopping?" "Yes, I'm new to America." "Where from?" "Germany." She paused, processed that, decided it didn't matter. "Well, welcome. The Coke's on sale. 3 cases for $1. Can't beat that." "Can't beat that. 3 cases of Coca-Cola for $1. 3 cases of the luxury that had broken his worldview 14 months earlier. Now just a product on sale. Ordinary, available, unremarkable. He bought 1 case, carried it to the checkout. The cashier rang it up without interest, 85 cents including tax. He paid with American money earned through American work. That evening he drank a Coca-Cola in his small apartment. It tasted the same as it had in Camp Concordia, cold, sweet, fizzy. But the context was different. Then it was evidence. Now it was just soda. Progress, maybe. December 1946, the newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, ran an article about German POWs who'd stayed in America. Hartmann was interviewed. "Do you regret staying?" the reporter asked. "No, Germany is rebuilding, but I can't help rebuild. Not from inside. I'm tainted by association with the Reich. Better to rebuild my own life elsewhere and maybe contribute to Germany later, indirectly." "Do you feel American?" "Not yet, but I'm becoming American. It's a process." "What surprised you most about America?" Hartmann laughed. "The Coca-Cola. That sounds trivial, but it's not. When I was a prisoner and they gave us Coca-Cola, ice cold, unlimited, that's when I understood we'd never stood a chance. Not because of your military, but because of your society. You were so wealthy you could afford to treat prisoners with dignity. Germany couldn't even treat its own people that well." The article ran on page 4, small circulation, minimal impact, but it felt important, acknowledging publicly who he'd been and who he was becoming. 1947, 1949. The building years. The work continued, bridge after bridge, highway after highway, infrastructure for a country that seemed to grow constantly, that couldn't build fast enough to satisfy expansion. Hartmann became senior engineer, then project lead. His accent marked him as foreign, but his competence marked him as valuable. America cared more about the latter than the former. He made friends, American friends. Goldstein became close. They worked together for 3 years. Others, too. Jim Morrison from the Chicago office, Patricia Alvarez, a structural engineer from New Mexico. They knew his background, didn't care, or rather, cared that he'd learned from it, that he'd changed, that he was contributing now. He dated, unsuccessfully at first. Explaining his past to American women was complicated, but eventually he met Sarah, a librarian from Milwaukee, whose grandfather had been German. She understood cultural complexity. They married in 1949. His mother wrote occasionally, letters describing Reconstruction in Germany, the Marshall Plan aid, the emergence of the Federal Republic. She wanted him to return. He couldn't explain why he wouldn't, but he sent money, American dollars converting to Deutsche Marks at favorable rates, helping her rebuild, contributing from a distance. 1950, citizenship oath. 5 years of residency, continuous employment, clean record, passing the citizenship test, all requirements met. The ceremony was at the Chicago courthouse on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in March. 27 people from 17 countries, all taking the oath, all becoming American. I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty. Hartmann said the words, meant them, felt something shift internally, not erasing who he'd been, that was impossible, but adding a new identity, becoming both and neither, a former German, a new American. A bridge between identities, just as he built bridges between places. The judge, an elderly man named Patterson, spoke after the oath, "You are now Americans. That means something. It means you believe in certain principles. Liberty, equality, democracy. These aren't just words. They're commitments. You've chosen them. Live up to them." Hartmann received his citizenship certificate. In 5 years, he'd gone from Wehrmacht officer to American citizen. The transformation seemed impossible, yet here was the document. Legal proof of reinvention. Sarah hugged him. "Congratulations, citizen." "Danke, sorry, thank you. You can still speak German, you know." "I know, but I'm trying to think in English." "Why?" "Because thinking shapes being. I want to be American. So I should think like American." "That's very German of you, overthinking becoming American." He laughed. She was right. You couldn't force identity. It emerged naturally, through choices and time. 1960, return visit. 15 years after leaving Germany, Hartmann returned, business trip. Morrison Bradley had contracted with a German firm to consult on Autobahn expansion, professional engagement. Nothing personal, except it was personal. The flight landed in Frankfurt, modern airport, efficient customs. The Germany he'd left in 1945 had been rubble and chaos. This Germany was rebuilt, prosperous, functional. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, had transformed destruction into production in just 15 years. Driving to Essen, he saw new construction everywhere, factories operating, roads paved, cities rebuilt in modern style, concrete and glass replacing the ornate architecture that bombs had destroyed. It looked efficient, prosperous, almost American in its utilitarian modernity. Essen was unrecognizable. The Krupp works operated again, producing peacetime goods now, steel for construction, machinery for industry. The city center was entirely new, built on the footprints of what had been. His old neighborhood no longer existed. The street where he'd grown up was now a parking lot for a shopping center. He met his mother at his aunt's house, still standing miraculously in the countryside. She'd aged dramatically. 72 now, frail, her hands twisted with arthritis, but alive, surviving. Klaus, she held him, cried, "You came back. Just visiting, Mutter, just for work. But you came." They sat in the small kitchen. His aunt made coffee, real coffee imported from Brazil, readily available. Germany could afford such things again. The Marshall Plan had worked. American aid had rebuilt what American bombs destroyed. "Tell me about America," his mother said. He did. Carefully. His work, his wife, his life. He didn't mention how comfortable he'd become, how thoroughly American he'd grown. It seemed cruel to emphasize prosperity when she lived on a modest pension in a small rural house, but she knew anyway. "You sound American," she said. "The accent, the words. Even in German you sound American. I've been there 15 years. I know, I'm not criticizing. I'm glad you found a home. Germany is still home, too." "No," she said gently. "Germany is where you're from. America is where you live. There's a difference." They talked through the afternoon. She told him about the Reconstruction, about denazification trials that everyone tried to forget, about the Federal Republic establishing itself, about the division between East and West, the Iron Curtain, the new reality of a split Germany. "Do you think we learned?" she asked. "From what happened?" "I don't know. Did we?" "Some of us. Others just pretend it never happened. Or that we were all victims. There's a lot of convenient forgetting. Maybe forgetting is necessary to move forward. Or maybe forgetting guarantees repetition. They had no answers, just questions. The German condition in 1960, prosperity built on unresolved guilt. 1960, the business meeting. The German engineering firm, Bauer und Söhne, was thoroughly professional. The conference room could have been in Chicago. The presentation could have been at Morris and Bradley. Only the language marked it as German. Hartmann presented in German, his first professional German presentation in 15 years. The words came back, but the concepts were English. He kept catching himself translating idioms that didn't quite work. The lead German engineer, Dietrich Zimmermann, no relation to the Zimmermann from camp, asked good questions. Technical questions, professional questions. Then, during a break, "You're the American consultant?" "I'm American now, but yes, originally German." "Wehrmacht?" "Yes," Zimmermann nodded. "So was I. Eastern Front, captured by Soviets, 5 years in Siberia, came back in 1950. I was captured by Americans. Kansas." "Kansas." Zimmermann laughed bitterly. "I heard about the American camps, Coca-Cola and baseball. We had frozen mud and typhus. I'm sorry. Not your fault. Just luck. You went west. I went east. You got democracy. I got communism. You got integration. I got gulags." He paused. "But we both survived. We're both building now instead of destroying. So maybe it worked out." The conversation moved back to bridges and highways, but the moment lingered. Two former Wehrmacht soldiers, 15 years later, designing infrastructure for peaceful prosperity. The transformation, made physical. 1960, visit to Munich. Hartmann had free time before returning to America. He visited Munich, a city he'd never seen during the war but had heard about, the beer halls, the culture, the Bavarian identity. Munich had been heavily bombed but was rebuilt beautifully. The city center mixed restoration of historic buildings with modern construction. The Marienplatz was crowded with shoppers. The beer halls operated as they had for centuries. He sat in the Hofbräuhaus, ordered beer and schnitzel, listened to the conversation around him. Germans talking about normal things, football, politics, economic growth, vacation plans. The war was discussed occasionally, but always at distance, as if it had happened to different people in a different country. A young couple sat nearby, early 20s, too young to remember. The war was history to them, not memory. They laughed about something. She playfully hit his arm. He stole a bite of her food. Young love, unburdened by the past. That was the future. A generation that would know the war only through textbooks and their parents' silence. They would build a Germany without the baggage. They would be European rather than nationalist. They would integrate rather than dominate. Or maybe that was wishful thinking. Maybe each generation had to learn the same lessons. Maybe peace was always temporary, always fragile, always one crisis away from collapse. Hartmann drank his beer. It tasted like Germany, but he felt American. The duality was strange but manageable. He contained multitudes, former soldier, current engineer, German by birth, American by choice, both and neither. 1965. The bottle. Hartmann's son, David, born in 1952, asked about the war. He was 13, old enough to understand, old enough to need honest answers. They sat in their Chicago living room. Sarah had diplomatically made herself scarce. "Dad, were you a Nazi?" "No, I was a soldier. There's a difference, but not as much as I used to think." "Did you kill people?" "Yes, in combat. Not civilians, not Jews, not prisoners. But yes, I killed." "Do you feel bad about it?" "Every day." "Then why did you do it?" "How do you explain the propaganda, the peer pressure, the national mythology, the gradual normalization of evil, the fact that most people in most circumstances follow orders and rationalize later?" "Because I believed lies," Hartmann said, "and because I was too cowardly to question them. And because once you're in a system, it's easier to obey than resist." "But you're not like that now." "No, because I learned, because I saw what obedience without morality produces, because I was captured by people who showed me a better way." "The Americans." "Yes." David thought about that. "So America saved you?" "In a way. They could have been cruel. They could have treated us like we deserved. Instead, they gave us Coca-Cola." "What?" Hartmann went to the refrigerator, pulled out 2 bottles of Coke, opened them, handed one to his son. "When I was a prisoner, they gave us this, ice, cold, unlimited supply. And in that moment I understood that we'd lost, not because they were stronger soldiers, but because they were a wealthier society. They could afford to be generous. We could barely afford to survive." David sipped his Coke. "It's just soda." "To you, yes. To me in 1945 it was revelation. It was proof that everything I'd believed was wrong, that America wasn't weak or decadent, that prosperity doesn't come from conquest, that societies that treat people well, even enemies, are stronger than societies built on fear." "Is that why you became American?" "Yes, because I wanted to be part of something that builds rather than destroys, that includes rather than excludes, that offers Coca-Cola rather than concentration camps." They sat in silence. David finished his Coke, set the bottle down. "Dad, do you think it could happen again?" "What?" "What happened in Germany? Could it happen here?" Hartmann wanted to say no, wanted to reassure, but honesty mattered more than comfort. "Maybe. It happened in Germany because normal people made bad choices, because they believed lies that sounded like truth, because they prioritized loyalty over morality. Those conditions can exist anywhere, even here. So how do we stop it? By remembering, by questioning, by choosing principles over power, by treating people, all people, with dignity, by never believing that any group is superior or that cruelty is justified. That's a lot of responsibility. Yes, that's the price of freedom. You have to defend it constantly. You have to choose it every day. David nodded slowly. 13 years old, grappling with history and morality and the weight of his father's past. "I'm glad you're my dad," he said finally, "even with everything." Hartmann felt something break inside, not painfully, a breaking open rather than apart. "I'm glad too," he said. 1975, the reunion, Morris and Bradley held a 30th anniversary celebration. Hartmann had been with the firm for 29 years, nearly since its founding in 1946. He was senior partner now, responsible for major projects, mentoring younger engineers. At the celebration, someone unexpected arrived, Werner Strasser. Hartmann hadn't seen him since 1946, when Strasser had returned to Germany immediately upon release. They'd exchanged a few letters in the late 40s, then lost contact. Now here he was, older but recognizable, at a Chicago engineering firm's anniversary party. "Klaus." They shook hands, German formality in American setting. "Werner, what are you doing here?" "Consulting contract. I work for Bauer und Söhne. We partnered with Morris and Bradley on the Detroit Bridge project. I saw your name on the partner list. Thought I'd come see if it was you." They found a quiet corner, caught up. Strasser had returned to Germany, worked construction during the Reconstruction, eventually trained as a civil engineer himself. Married, 3 children, a life rebuilt from ruins. "Do you ever regret staying in America?" Strasser asked. "No. Do you regret going back?" "Sometimes. Germany is wealthy now, but it's also careful, afraid of itself. We don't trust ourselves. The guilt is paralyzing. America has guilt too. Vietnam, civil rights, we're not innocent. But you can talk about it. You can protest. You can change. Germany just tries to forget." They were quiet. 2 former Wehrmacht officers, now in their 60s, comparing notes on redemption and reconstruction. "Do you remember the Coca-Cola?" Hartmann asked. Strasser laughed. "Every day. That was the moment, wasn't it, when we realized that we'd never stood a chance, that we'd been fighting the future with the past, that prosperity beats ideology, that human dignity is not weakness." They raised their glasses, bourbon, not Coca-Cola, but the gesture was the same. "To survival," Strasser said. "To transformation," Hartmann replied. "To becoming better than we were." They drank. 1985, looking back. Hartmann retired at 70. He'd designed 43 bridges, 27 highway interchanges, and contributed to dozens of other infrastructure projects. His work connected cities, enabled commerce, facilitated lives. Not redemption exactly. You can't redeem genocide with bridges. But contribution. Building rather than destroying. He wrote a memoir, not for publication, just for his children and grandchildren, so they would know, so they would understand. The title, "The Bottle That Changed Everything." He started with the moment in Camp Concordia, the cold glass, the fizzing sweetness, the cognitive dissonance. He traced backward, his life before, during, and after the war. The propaganda, the fighting, the collapse, the capture, the transformation. He wrote honestly about his failings, his complicity, his cowardice in not resisting, but also about learning, about changing, about choosing better once he understood better. The final chapter was called Lessons for the Future. "What I learned in Camp Concordia wasn't just that America was wealthy. It was that wealth comes from certain choices. Inclusion over exclusion, cooperation over domination, dignity over humiliation, production over conquest. Nazi Germany believed strength came from purity and discipline. American democracy proved that strength comes from diversity and freedom. We built walls. They built bridges. We hoarded resources. They created abundance. We demanded loyalty. They earned it. The Coca-Cola wasn't just a drink. It was a symbol of what prosperity looks like when it's based on human dignity rather than human subjugation. It was proof that generosity is not weakness, that abundance is possible without empire, that former enemies can become friends. I spent 30 years as a German soldier and citizen. I've spent 40 years as an American citizen. I'm better for the transformation. So is the world. If there's a lesson, it's this. Choose carefully what you believe. Question authority. Demand evidence. Treat all humans as humans. Build rather than destroy. And never ever think that cruelty is strength. Also, never underestimate the power of cold Coca-Cola on a hot day. He ended with humor because that's what he'd learned in America, that serious truths could be delivered lightly, that propaganda could be resisted with irony, that the future was built through hope rather than fear. 1995, the end. Klaus Hartmann died at 85. Heart attack, quick and painless, according to doctors. He was in his garden, tending roses when it happened. The funeral was attended by family, friends, colleagues. His children spoke, his grandchildren, old friends from Morris and Bradley. Even Strasser came from Germany, elderly now, but determined to pay respects. Sarah gave the eulogy. Klaus was a complicated man. He came from darkness but chose light. He made terrible mistakes but learned from them. He fought for evil but spent his life building good. He was German and American and something more, human in the fullest sense. He used to tell a story about Coca-Cola in a prison camp, about how a simple act of generosity changed his worldview, about how wealth is less about money than about values, about how the future belongs to those who build bridges rather than walls. That was Klaus, a bridge between past and future, between Germany and America, between who we are and who we can become. He's gone now, but the bridges remain. The work remains. The lesson remains. Choose carefully. Build diligently. Treat people with dignity. And always, always question authority. Rest in peace, Klaus. You earned it. They buried him in a Chicago cemetery. American flag on the coffin. German hymns sung at graveside. Both identities honored. Both acknowledged. Both integrated into something larger than either. 2025, 80 years later. David Hartmann, Klaus's son, stood in a museum in Berlin, the topography of terror built on the site of the former Gestapo headquarters, exhibits documenting the Holocaust, the war, the occupation, the reconstruction. One exhibit featured personal stories of transformation, Germans who'd been Nazis and became Democrats, soldiers who'd fought and later built peace. Among them, his father's story, condensed to 3 paragraphs and a photograph. Klaus Hartmann, 1913-1995, served in the Wehrmacht during World War II. Captured by American forces in 1945, he was held at Camp Concordia, Kansas. The experience transformed his worldview. He emigrated to the United States, became a civil engineer, and spent 40 years building infrastructure. In his memoir, he credited a bottle of Coca-Cola in a prison camp with teaching him that true strength comes from generosity rather than cruelty. His story exemplifies the possibility of transformation even after complicity in evil. David read it twice, his father's entire life reduced to a museum plaque. But that was history, compression and simplification. The complexity lived in memory, in the stories David would tell his own children. A German teenager stood nearby, reading the same plaque. She turned to David. "Did you know him?" "He was my father." "Really? What was he like?" David thought about it. How do you summarize a life? A transformation? A man who contained multitudes? "He was complicated," David said. "He made mistakes. But he learned. He changed. He spent his life trying to build a better world than the one he'd helped destroy." Do you think it worked? I'm here, aren't I? American German, visiting a museum that honestly documents history. My father fought in a war that tried to destroy this kind of honesty. Now his story is part of that honesty. So yes, It worked. The girl nodded, moved on to the next exhibit. David lingered at the plaque, thought about his father's memoir, about the Coca-Cola story he'd heard dozens of times, about transformation and redemption and the long, difficult work of becoming better. He pulled out his phone, took a picture of the plaque, posted it to social media with a caption, "My father's story, Wehrmacht soldier to American citizen, from destroying to building, proof that people can change, that former enemies can become friends, that the future doesn't have to repeat the past." Within hours, it had thousands of likes, comments from Germans and Americans and people from around the world. Some praised, some criticized, some shared their own stories of transformation and redemption, but they engaged, they discussed, they remembered. That was the legacy. Not perfection, not complete redemption, just the possibility of learning, of changing, of building something better. David left the museum. Outside, Berlin bustled with life, tourists, students, business people, a city rebuilt from ruins, now capital of a unified democratic Germany. The future that Klaus Hartmann had helped build, one bridge at a time. He stopped at a cafe, ordered a Coca-Cola, ice cold, fizzing, the same drink that had changed his father's life 80 years earlier. He raised the bottle in silent toast. To transformation, to redemption, to the long, difficult work of becoming better than we were, to his father, to all those who chose to change. The bottle sweated in his hand, the fizz exploded on his tongue, the taste was sweet and cold and ordinary, just Coca-Cola, and everything.